The glove was clean. Everyone in that room knew it before the inspection was even finished. The bat was regulation. The pine tar was within limits. The grip was standard. There was nothing in Shohei Ohtani's equipment that morning that did not belong there. Nothing that violated a single rule written in any official document the league has ever produced. The inspection found nothing. And that finding was more damning than anything it could have found. Because the question was never really about the glove. The question was never really about the bat. The question that the investigation spent 11 days answering was simpler than that and harder than that, and the answer, when it finally came, landed in the middle of baseball like something dropped from a very great height. The question was why the inspection happened at all. It had started on a Tuesday night. A game that, on paper, looked like any other game in a long season full of games. The Dodgers were on the road. Ohtani was in the lineup. The stadium was full in the particular way stadiums fill when his name appears on the visiting team's card, because there are now people in every city in this country who come to the ballpark specifically to watch him, regardless of which team they have spent their lives supporting. The umpire working home plate that night was a man who had been in the league for 16 years. 16 years is long enough to have developed instincts. Long enough to have worked thousands of games. Long enough that your presence behind the plate carries a certain institutional weight, the weight of experience and tenure and all the decisions you have made correctly over a very long time. His name does not need to be the center of this story to understand what happened. But what happened begins with him. In the third inning, Ohtani hit a ball that left the park. There was no ambiguity about it. The trajectory was clear from the moment of contact. The crowd reacted before the ball had traveled 50 feet, the way crowds react when something is obviously and immediately over. It landed 12 rows deep in left field. The umpire signaled home run. And then, 7 pitches later, on a completely separate at-bat, the same umpire called a pitch that was visibly outside the zone as strike 3. Ohtani stood at the plate. He said nothing. He walked back to the dugout. The Dodgers went on to lose by 1 run. Afterward, in the tunnel, one of the Dodgers coaches was asked about the called third strike. His answer was 3 words. He said, "Watch the tape." The tape was watched. By everyone. Immediately and repeatedly and from every available angle. The conclusion was not complicated. The pitch was not close. The pitch was not the kind of pitch that exists in the gray area where reasonable people can disagree about what the rulebook says. It was outside. Measurably. Documentably. In the way that modern ball tracking technology makes certain things impossible to dispute. But the tape revealed something else too. Something that took longer to see because it required watching not the ball but the man behind the plate. His positioning had been unusual that night. His framing of pitches had been inconsistent in ways that did not follow the normal patterns of an experienced umpire working a difficult game. And in the moments before the critical call, his body language had shifted in a way that several people who study umpire mechanics professionally described, carefully and without accusation, as deliberate. That word. Deliberate. It sat in the conversation for 2 days before anyone with official authority picked it up. On the third day, MLB opened a formal investigation. What the investigation found in its first week was procedural. Documentary. The kind of findings that build the foundation for larger conclusions. Communication records. Positioning data. A review of every call the umpire had made in games involving the Dodgers over the previous 2 months. That last part is where the foundation started to crack. The pattern that emerged from that review was not subtle. It was not the kind of pattern that requires sophisticated statistical modeling to identify. It was visible in the raw numbers. In game after game, in situation after situation, calls that fell in the borderline category resolved against the Dodgers at a rate that the league's own analysts described as statistically improbable. Not impossible. Nothing in baseball is impossible when you are dealing with human judgment operating under pressure in real time. But improbable. Significantly improbable. The kind of improbable that has a number attached to it, and the number was large enough that the investigators stopped describing what they were seeing as a pattern of errors and started using a different word. Bias. On the 9th day of the investigation, the umpire was called in for a formal interview. These interviews are not public. The details of what was said inside that room have not been officially released. But people familiar with the process described the atmosphere afterward as heavy in the particular way things are heavy when a long-held position has finally been abandoned. He had arrived prepared to defend himself. That much was clear from how the interview began. He had answers ready for the questions about positioning. He had explanations prepared for the statistical anomalies. He had the vocabulary of a man who had spent 9 days constructing a version of events that he could live inside. By the time the interview ended, that version had not survived. The investigators had footage he had not seen. They had data he had not been given access to. They had, in the careful methodical way of people who do this work professionally, assembled a picture that was complete enough that the prepared answers stopped fitting the questions being asked. At some point in the final hour of that interview, the prepared answers stopped coming. What came instead was silence. And then something that the people in that room had not anticipated when the day began. He asked if he could make a statement. They told him he could. And Dan Iasagna began to cry. The public apology came 2 days later, after the investigation had formally concluded and the findings had been submitted to the commissioner's office. He did not have to make it publicly. Nothing in the process required him to sit in front of cameras and speak. He could have let the official documents carry the weight of what had been found and said nothing. He chose differently. He came into the room without the composure that 16 years behind the plate might have suggested he would bring. His jacket was slightly wrong. His eyes were already carrying what the previous 11 days had cost him. He sat down, adjusted nothing, and looked at the assembled reporters for a long moment before he spoke. He did not begin with context. He did not begin with the mechanics of umpiring or the difficulty of real-time decision-making or the inherent imperfection of human judgment operating at the speed of a major league game. He began with the only thing that, by that point, was left to begin with. He said he had been wrong. Not wrong the way a person is wrong when they make a mistake in good faith and can point to the fog of the moment as explanation. Wrong in a way that he was no longer able to describe using the language of mistake. He said that the footage had shown him things about his own behavior that he had not been willing to see clearly before the investigation made it impossible not to see them. He said the word that the investigators had used. He said it himself, without being asked. Bias. He said it quietly. Without drama. In the way a person says something when they have spent a long time refusing to say it and the refusal has finally cost more than the saying. The room was very still. Then he said Ohtani's name. He said that Shohei Ohtani had come to this country and given this sport something it had not had before and had asked for nothing in return except to be allowed to compete on a field where the rules applied equally to everyone. He said that was not an extraordinary request. He said it was the most basic thing the sport owed every player who walked onto it. He said he had failed to provide it. Not once. Over time. In ways that he had not admitted to himself until the investigation made admission the only available option. His voice broke on the last sentence. Not completely. But enough. He pressed both hands flat on the table in front of him. He looked down at them for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet and his expression was the expression of a man standing at the end of something with nothing left to protect. He said he was sorry. Not to the institution. Not to the league. Not to the abstract integrity of the game. To Shohei Ohtani. By name. Directly. The room did not move. The disciplinary findings were announced the following morning. A lifetime ban. Not a suspension. Not a fine. Not the kind of consequence that carries a timeline at the end of which a person returns and the institution moves forward. A lifetime ban. The most severe action available to the Commissioner of Baseball. Reserved for violations that the sport has decided exist outside the boundary of what can be corrected and continued from. 4 other umpires received significant suspensions. The investigation had found that the behavior, while centered on one person, had not been entirely isolated. That there had been awareness in adjacent places that had not been converted into action. The suspensions were the league's way of saying that awareness without action carries its own accountability. The reaction was immediate and it was large. Not just in baseball. In the wider space where Ohtani's name now lives, which is larger than baseball, larger than sports, extending into places where the details of a called third strike would not normally reach. Because this was not really about a called third strike. It was about something older and simpler and more important than any single call on any single night. It was about whether the field is level. Whether the rules apply equally. Whether the person who comes furthest and asks for least and gives most can trust that what he is standing on is solid. The investigation had concluded that it had not been solid. Not consistently. Not in the way it should have been. And the sport had responded with the only language serious enough for what had been found. Ohtani played that night. He went to the plate 4 times. He hit the ball hard 3 of those times. In the 7th inning, on a 3-2 count, he watched a borderline pitch go by. The new umpire called it a ball. Ohtani walked to first base. He stood with his foot on the bag and his eyes already moving forward. The stadium gave him something between an ovation and an exhale. The sound of an entire building releasing something it had been holding. There are things the sport cannot give back. Moments that were taken and cannot be returned by any investigation or any announcement or any tearful apology, however sincerely it was offered. But there are things the sport can do. It can look at what was found and name it clearly. It can apply the consequence that the naming requires. It can stand in front of a microphone and say that what happened was not acceptable and will not be tolerated and has been addressed in the most permanent way available. It did those things. Whether that is enough is a question the sport will be living with for a long time. But on a quiet evening in a ballpark somewhere, Shohei Ohtani stood on first base with his eyes already moving forward. And that, at least, was exactly as it should be.